Hi everyone, welcome to this National Art Education Association presentation, which has been canceled or rescheduled, so I hope that you enjoy it for your purposes because it occurred to me that it might relate to a lot of what's going on right now. So this pot here that you see is one of many gifts from one of my students, a late student who unfortunately passed, Robert Chinosi, who was a teaching artist, a tattoo artist, a former reality TV star, and an art educator in training. His writing and his artwork from his life and during his death from cancer inspired a lot of my thinking for this presentation. So I'm not an art therapist, but psychology has always been a part of my life and my work as an artist and an art educator. This started for me when I was younger at home. My mom was a high school dropout, actually, who went from her GED to her doctorate in psychology, and I grew up in her university libraries. She was actually a painter, and a lot of the time when she would share, not private confidential patient details, but just general experiences about the human spirit and the human experience. She would often compare it to something from Shakespeare or Victorian literature or a contemporary film to give us sort of a better sense of how she understood the world and how we might, my sisters and I. She felt that painting was her outlet until she became a psychologist, which I thought was really interesting. And I've always been sort of curious about it, being the kid of a shrink. And as I grew older, I looked at a study from Thomas Mader in the late 80s about how the children of psychologists and psychiatrists called psy kids, like my sisters and I, he wondered, why so many of us went into the arts. My older sister's a writer, and I'm an artist, and my younger sister actually does art as well. So thinking about that, I started to wonder, also considering my student, how the artist's role can be sort of a shamanic calling, like a healer or a wise person who might, through perception and reflection and creation, fill the gap of sort of these missing wise people. And obviously that's sort of a lot of ego and a lot of a very big role to fill, but at the same time, it's something that's not really being filled by other roles. And I think as well it's important to kind of distinguish where is art education and where is art therapy and where is psychology. So some of the things for us, I think, as art educators, when we talk about healing, I think development is really important. Coping is really useful. Looking at creative growth, looking at arts learning, and looking at holism versus outright therapy, right? And we have these resonant quotes that I think talk about the power of the arts. Take your broken heart and turn it into art. That there is a sense of alchemy and magic to what we do. So some of my own research that I'll just gloss over really quick led me to look at kind of aesthetics and trauma, which is really big right now. Trauma-informed education, trauma-informed art education. Most recently, some of my older research around gender and comic books, people were encouraging me, which was quite flattering, to write more about that. So what I was interested in doing, whether they liked it or not, was looking at strong women superheroes in comic book adaptations and looking at sort of the fraught roles of trauma treatment and therapies. So I looked at Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which some of you may remember or maybe heard of from the 90s, and I looked at Jessica Jones, which is on Netflix. I think it's a really interesting show. Unfortunately, it's canceled. But the first season is really solid, and the second season actually has a Shakespearean actress in it who I think is phenomenal. It's really, really worth watching. But anyways, both of these shows explore gender, and they explore psychological issues of strength and frailty. Both Buffy and Jessica have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder due to the supernatural events that traumatize them, although these events occur within very human relationships and struggles. And what I started to posit was that the supernatural context of settings and plots reflect the murkiness and the difficulties of naming, responding to, and or recovering from trauma. So Jessica Jones, on the right, her therapy occurs occurs before the season even begins. She has some flashbacks to it. And traces of this therapy are evident in mantras that she's adopted to stave off her panic attacks about her kidnapping and her rape. Buffy the Vampire Slayer presents several of Buffy's various complicated but compelling encounters with counseling. And each of them notably ends disastrously, often compounding her trauma and her traumatic experiences. From a promising but slain high school guidance counselor, who you see on the far left, to an insightful, recently sired, made into a vampire psychology student who she has to slay after they have sort of a pseudo therapy session, which is very interesting, thinking about annihilation, to her charismatic college professor and her mentor, who's actually a psychologist, Maggie Walsh, who's also brutally killed. It becomes sort of a competitive relationship, and Professor Walsh is taken over by her kind of lesser instincts and her lesser goals. As each of these therapeutic experiences become more and more dangerous for Buffy and for the therapist, her final psychiatric encounter is a demon-induced dream in which she believes she's institutionalized. She's actually in a mental hospital, and her psychiatrist inform her that her heroism or vampire slaying is all in her head. It's a delusion. She can return to a peaceful and demonless home where her mother, who I hope I'm not spoiling anything, so stop here if you haven't watched it and you want to, just fast forward a little, but her deceased mother is still living and has never divorced her father. Buffy even admits to her close friend Willow that her parents had actually briefly institutionalized her when she began first slaying demons and vampires before the show takes place, because they didn't believe her accounts about her life. And this deep fear of being misunderstood and being institutionalized remains with Buffy throughout her teens and her early adulthood, which is really interesting. But long story short, because this doesn't relate as much to what we do as art educators, I think it comes up in the classroom and sort of in the culture, but I want to get more into that. My observation was that Jessica and Buffy struggle to maintain their specialized roles and their hyper-focused visions of reality as superheroes. They often find mental health resources to be incompatible with their focus and their vision. Both of them believe and encourage their friends and acquaintances to seek professional help, but they themselves are generally unable to do so. And I think there's a metaphor here for strong women that perhaps a lot of their heroic roles are particularly fragmented by conflicting expectations around caregiving and crime fighting, leaving little room for self, leaving little room for self-doubt and breakdown and self-analysis. And I thought this was really interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to explore as an art educator is the complex psychological armor often echoed in the striking environments and fashion choices. So one episode that everybody hated of Jessica Jones, and I saw sort of misunderstood, Jessica daydreams about escaping from the grasp of her rapist by leaping off a New York City building. She's wearing this long and yellow floral gown you can see on the far right, and she's against this beautiful blue cerulean sky. Her yellow dress is paired with her signature practical black combat boots. She's feminine, but she's also athletic and moving. She lands from her imagined leap gracefully. She mounts a gorgeous white horse that carries her off into the city. She becomes, I think, her own white knight, her own rescuer. And I related this as an art educator, not to sort of poor storytelling or a cliche, but how the horse itself is widely significant in feminine aesthetics. You think of Leonora Carrington, I think as well in artistic development, Victor Lowenfeld noted that the horse that we see in so many young girls' drawings is about escape and movement and the joy of growing up. As well, we can talk about the apocalypse and the white horse and the white dresses of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But this idea of pairing weaponry and leaps of faith and fairy tale inspired heroine against mythic monsters, I think offer us this hybrid warrior princess goddess aesthetic that I see as really powerful and redemptive. So getting back to art education, not just the screens that affect it, but the classroom. There is some good stuff out there about art education research on trauma without going beyond our field. Paul Duncombe, who you probably know from his visual culture studies, he wrote about the deep anxieties associated with contemporary cultures of violence and fear in terms of art, highlighting responsive art education programs that examine really mass media violence imagery, so the things that we're inundated with through Facebook and the news, protest art, As well, we think of Banksy, for example, and art relating to bullying and school shooting. So looking at how we can speak back to some of these images. Smilin chronicles several generative art activities, and she emphasizes these should be in collaboration with trained counselors. So seek out your guidance counselors, seek out other art educators who might be art therapists or have that background, who can build resilience in the face of traumas, including observational drawing of growth in nature. So think about, doing stuff around the spring isn't just sort of a fun seasonal thing. It also is this felt relationship with emerging from winter, emerging from natural disasters, something I think really relevant to us right now as well. Resolution scrapbooking around a conflict. I think we see scrapbooking as very kind of benign and tame, but the idea of a scrapbook that begins to resolve something painful and focus on growth and improvement, and personal narrative sketchbooks to process traumatic events. And I would highlight here the Brooklyn Art Library and their sketchbook project as one outlet for doing that is local to us in New York. Czech has some really interesting stuff around recovery work for the transgender community in the face of trauma. So emphasizing themes that I think work really well with the art room: safety and empowerment, post-trauma, recovery as restoring or recreating connection between the public and the private. And obviously we have to do that carefully, between the individual and the community, between men and women. So looking at art as a means for connection and understanding. And then my own area is really craft, and I've been working with a variety of different craft projects over the years, and it occurs to me that most of them and my involvement with them are born out of a struggle that I had around gender issues, or a struggle that I had acclimating myself to my first full-time position in Virginia as a New Yorker who didn't even know how to drive. So looking at how craft practices and social and emotional learning can be a part of trauma-informed education in art for individuals and communities. So, moving is a slightly traumatic thing. There are much more traumatic things that happen to the students that we work with. And art is really a means of connecting socially, of being able to understand yourself emotionally. And although art educators are not typically trained as therapists, the practice of creating can be illuminating. That most of the therapists who I work with, and even psychoanalysts, are using a lot of drawing, even if they don't really know how to do it and they don't really know how to interpret it. Don't tell them I said that. But it can be really illuminating as a framework for understanding trauma and exploring attachment relationships. And right now in the psychological world, I think most things are either around trauma or around attachment. And for those of you who are parents, you're probably somewhat familiar with the concept of attachment, that the way that we bond with our moms or our dads or our grandmas or whoever adopted us or raised us becomes a template for other relationships with other people. And you can see these patterns, not to oversimplify, but when we create, it allows us to understand some of those frameworks of how we connect with things. And there are comparisons here too of art being a form of child as well, that can be kind of a redemptive way of exploring attachment relationships. Further, creative arts practice has been linked with neurological evidence of processing and neutralizing trauma. So that's to say that even if you don't have the tools and the training and the means to deal with these kinds of situations, you may find yourself, as I did as a fairly new teacher, working with students who didn't yet speak the language, who had just immigrated here, that they were processing things through their art. They were creating art that was cathartic to them and that was telling these stories that even if I, as a teacher, didn't quite know what to do with them, that was a process that was useful for them. And being there to listen, being there to witness, being there to work with them, caring about them, asking the team, what do you think about the student? Are they okay? What support do they need? Is a huge part of it and something that we all can develop. And you can see on the left, this is from the International Fiber Collaborative, which is not only about healing for the individuals working with it, but also healing the environment, drawing attention to our dependency on foreign oil and petroleum by covering a gas station with these messages. And on the right, this is from the Exquisite Uterus Project, which is really cool. It was this template of the uterus that's sent to various makers, and they all highlighted different elements of women's experiences. I was using here some beads and buttons that were donated from various women that I saw as mentors at my job. So a lot of these are from the 70s, before I was even born. But I loved kind of gathering them together in the feel of something that was comforting and crafty and feminine in a way that I couldn't relate to, but I really kind of enjoyed. And then I want to move a little more deeply into some of the philosophy of it that I think can be really helpful to us as art educators in terms of what we do and how we do it. So one of the quotes I really love from Glenn Adamson is is that craft is not only objects, but approaches, attitudes, and actions. So thinking about family legacies, thinking about imagined histories, thinking about how craft connects us and how craft represents us. MC Richards is on the right, and she's a person I really, really admire. Her Centering book is a fantastic one for anyone interested in philosophy, pottery, or poetry, or all of the above. And she says that we can't talk about the crafts without appealing to the involving spirit we have as humans. So really focusing in on development, looking at, for example, social work systems and approaches, that when we talk about craft, we're really speaking to the way that we make things, the way that we use things, the way that we relate to one another. And Richards also reminds us that there's a connection we ought to make between what we profess, what we say we believe in as creatures sensitive to form, as artists, and what we practice in our communities. And this was something that really rang true to me. And that's not to say that I would always identify as a social justice art educator, but that there should be a connection between what we make and what we love and how we treat one another, how we engage with everyone in our school and everyone in our lives. And I think for me, particularly interested in gender, and as well kind of transgressing it in interesting ways through the crafts, Constance Klassen had this great book on the senses. And she says that through craft work, a lot of women historically could explore alternatives to dominant masculine visual aesthetics. And this isn't to malign male artists, but just to say that, the huge sculpture made of steel isn't always what women or men or anyone wants to make. And at the same time, we can remain safely within the bounds of acceptable so-called feminine practice. So these kinds of relationships, I remember having a professor who said, it's cool that you're into craft, Courtney, because it's soft like you are. And I didn't feel like it was meant as a compliment, but I thought, I'm going to make that a compliment. I'm going to reclaim that. And then at the same time, I think looking to Shona Robertson, who's a fantastic art educator and theorist, particularly speaking to cultural competencies and identity issues, that the crafts are such a fundamental human activity. They're more basic than any one language, and they can create this bond between all of us as people practicing them, that there's something really amazing about creating a work that's never been done before, but using a method that people throughout all time and all space have shared. So these are some thoughts that I have so far on these topics. I hope that you find them interesting. I'm looking forward to organizing them further, and I would love to hear your thoughts on these, and I hope that this has been provocative and interesting for you, and that you're all staying safe and healthy. Take care.